Sage ran up on the stage. "Maybe you should turn it off, man," he said. Porter realized he had been frozen in horror. He quickly touched the button, and the machine sputtered to a stop. He looked at the pile of shavings and sawdust in the compartment, and then, fearfully, he looked at Jack. Jack's face was a mask of rage. His lips were pressed together in a tight line. Porter knew that when those lips parted, whatever came out of them was going to be bad. It was. What came out first was not even words, but the roar of a lion furious to discover it has been caged. He pounded the table with his fists. Finally, the words came out. "You absolute idiot! Is this some kind of sick joke?" "No, sir," Porter said. He was shaking and sweating profusely. "Something must have malfunctioned this time. It was working great before. You can ask Sage... Sage the liar?" Jack asked, his words dripping venom. No matter how terrified he was, Porter wasn't going to let Jack talk about his best friend like that. "Sir, Sage isn't—" "Don't argue with me," Jack yelled. "You all seem to have forgotten who's in charge here." He stood up from the table. He looked at Porter, then at Angie, Sage, and Edwin in turn. The look on his face was one of sheer disgust. "I can't imagine there is a business owner in the world with a sorrier group of employees. Lazy, incompetent." He looked at the machine and the mess of shavings and sawdust. "Destructive. No wonder this business is in the toilet. I'll go down with my ship like a good captain should, but I know who's to blame for it. The crew. I've got half a mind to fire you all here and now, but we open in 30 minutes, and look at this place. Clean it up, people." He stomped back to his office and slammed the door. Jack sure was mixing his metaphors there, Sage said. "I'm confused. Are we on a ship or in a toilet?" Angie shook her head. "I don't know how you can joke at a time like this. We're all going to get fired." "Oh, I don't think he'll fire us," Edwin said. "He won't want to hire or train new people, not with the business going under. We'll just lose our jobs when the restaurant closes." "Is that supposed to be good news?" Angie asked. Porter sat down with his friends at the table. They were the saddest-looking bunch he had ever seen, and he couldn't help but feel it was all his fault. "I'm sorry," Porter said. "I don't know what happened, but I do know I let you all down." "It's okay," Sage said. "All inventors learn trial and error. Today was the error part. There will be better days." Sage rose to his feet. Let me go get some supplies to clean this up." Together they swept the stage and wiped down the sawdust-covered tables. They used the giant wet-dry vac to suck up all the shavings off the carpet. Porter and Sage carried the failed machine back to its place in the storage room. Porter was desperate to look inside it and troubleshoot, but he knew that if he hoped to end his night still employed, he needed to focus on the one thing, following Jack's orders to the letter, no matter how demanding or ridiculous they were. He and Porter returned to the stage and mopped up the dusty residue. By the opening time, all evidence of the disaster was gone. Jack emerged from his office and surveyed the dining area. "See?" Porter said. "Spotless. You can't even tell what happened." "It'll do," Jack said. He took 2 steps closer to Porter so he was standing right in his face. "That dangerous piece of equipment you're responsible for could have destroyed my whole restaurant." He pointed his index finger at Porter. "You're fired. The rest of you too. Get out. Now!" "So you make us clean up like we're going to be opening, and then you fire us?" Sage said, confused and hurt. Jack grinned through his rage. "You see, unlike you all, I'm not a fool. I knew if I fired you, then asked you to clean up, the place would still be dirty." From the Puppet Carver by Sage Brantley. Sylvester knew that he could feel now because he felt pain beyond imagining. After he paid the fixer in money and promises he didn't look forward to keeping, the fixer had connected Sylvester to the machinery, and pain had shot through his body with the force of electricity as every new nerve, muscle, bone, and tendon in his body were shocked to life. The pain was so strong, he seemed to be able to see it, even hear it, as its intensity drowned out the sounds of his own screams. But since Sylvester had paid the price in pain, now he could feel pleasure too. As he walked the city streets, he could feel fresh air in his new lungs. He crossed the street, went into the park, and touched the bark of a tree. Hard, rough. He stopped at an ice cream truck and bought a cone just so he could touch his lips to its coldness. A lady walked by with a fluffy white dog on a leash. "Excuse me, could I please pet your dog?" Sylvester asked her. The lady smiled. "Sure, Sophia loves everybody." Sylvester knelt down and buried his newly sensate hands in the dog's fluffy coat. Tears sprang to his eyes. Now he knew what soft meant. "Thank you," Sylvester said to the dog's owner. The woman looked at him strangely. She said, "You're welcome," but quickly walked away. Sylvester looked down at his hands. They felt alive. For the first time since his creation, he felt alive. His hands itched and burned in desperation. All he could think about was what he wanted to touch next. Jack sat alone in his office, looking at the evening's few receipts. The only good thing about his situation was that he'd finally fired his idiot employees, so he could at least wallow in his misery in peace. He knew if he went home, Becky would want to talk to him about whatever new way she had found to spend the money that they didn't have. He knew he should have a talk with Becky about finances, but he couldn't bring himself to do it yet. Becky had married him in part because he was a good catch, with a promising future. How could he tell her he hadn't made good on that promise? Would she even stay with him if the money ran out? This was a woman who grew up with a mother telling her, "It's just as easy to love a rich man as a poor man," and who jokingly suggested that the words "for poorer" be struck from their wedding vows. Tick, tick. What was that noise? Jack didn't know if it had been going on a while without him noticing, or if it had just started. Either way, now that he heard it, he couldn't stop hearing it. Tick, tick. It sounded like an especially loud watch, or a ticking time bomb. Had somebody planted a bomb in the restaurant? If they had, it was a blessing. Jack tried to turn his attention back to his bookkeeping, but the noise was too distracting. Tick, tick. It was more than distracting. It was maddening. What was that Edgar Allan Poe story Jack had read in high school, where the guy kills the old man and then is driven crazy by the nonstop beating sound of the old man's heart? It was like that. Tick, tick. The sound seemed to be coming from behind the stage. Maybe it had something to do with one of the animatronics? Well, there was no way to get any work done with this sound rattling around in his brain. He might as well try to find the source and see if he could stop it. Tick, tick! The sound was louder when he was on the stage, so he was definitely getting warmer. He went backstage to the storage room. Tick, tick! Dusty curtain. Back of the room, behind an old dusty curtain, one of his idiot employees had hung up for some reason. He pulled back the curtain. Tick, tick! The sound was much louder now, unbearably loud. Jack clamped his hands over his ears. He looked at the disabled animatronics lined up like figures in a wax museum. They weren't where the noise was coming from. Tick! Tick! It was coming from the contraption, the horrible, mechanical abomination that fool Porter had made. The ticking sound, clearly coming from deep inside the machine's bowels, was making it shake so hard it seemed in danger of falling over. Jack pushed the button on the outside, but nothing happened. He opened the door, and the sound grew so loud he was sure it could be heard from outside the building. Tick, 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 tick! There was some type of control panel inside the machine. Maybe if he just stepped in for a moment, he could find the right button to make the horrible ticking stop. He stepped inside. It was a tight space. Jack hated tight spaces. The door slid shut with a click. He reached out to open it, but there was no handle on the inside. He thought of banging on the door and yelling, but there was no one there to hear him. And even if there was no way he could be heard over the horrible ticking, which was now so loud it felt like it was coming from inside his own skull. But then the ticking sound was drowned out by the whirring of machinery. The contraption appeared to have turned on. He looked at the walls of the machine. They were lined up with circular blades that had started to spin and were now extending from the walls toward his body. What was it that idiot had called the machine? The puppet carver? Jack's heart pounded in terror. He was going to be carved. There was no way to escape. All around him, the sharp metal blades reached toward his body, less than an inch from making contact with his arms. his legs, his face. This was it. He was going to die, and painfully. How long would it take, he wondered, for someone to find his body? No one would think to look for him here, not until there was a smell. Jack shut his eyes and prepared for the worst. Bang! He gasped, startled by the deafening noise. The loud bang was followed by a cloud of black smoke that filled the small space where Jack was trapped. There was a smell of ozone. He coughed and wondered if he would asphyxiate before the blades in the machine had time to shred him. Wait, the blades! The blades had stopped spinning. The machine was quiet. It must have malfunctioned in some way. The door slid open, releasing the smoke from the compartment. The machine made a sad sputtering noise, and then was still. Jack was alive! He couldn't believe it. He stepped out of the compartment like he was stepping into a new, better world. He looked himself over. No harm done. Not to him, anyway. The puppet carver might be broken beyond repair, but it hadn't really worked right in the first place. Jack felt himself smiling. When was the last time he had smiled genuinely? He couldn't even remember, but now, back from the cliff's edge of death, there seemed to be so many reasons to smile. The problems that had consumed him before didn't seem as important. Money didn't matter that much. All that mattered was that he was alive. Jack walked out of the building. He looked up at the night sky. The stars sparkled, and the moon blanketed the world in a silver glow. It was so beautiful that tears sprang to his eyes. When was the last time he had really seen the moon and the stars? When was the last time he cried? Looking back at the last decade of his life, the only feelings he could remember were anger and fear. Anger at his employees, at his wife, at his son. Fear of losing money, power, status. What kind of life was that? Well, that stopped now. It was a new day. Well, a new night anyway. He was going to be nicer to his wife, to his son, to his employees, to the random people he transacted with into day-to-day life. Jack felt his heart brimming with love and kindness. He was like Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol after his encounter with the ghosts, no longer a mean old miser, but a man who could find the goodness in life and people, and even within himself. Jack got in his car. How fortunate he was to have such a nice car. How fortunate he was to have a car at all. Many people were not so lucky. He started the car and headed toward home. He hoped Becky was still awake. He had a lot to say to her. "Oh," he said as he drove by the Golden Heifer. He turned back to the restaurant and pulled into the drive-thru line. When it was his turn, the voice on the intercom said, "Thank you for choosing Golden Heifer. Please order when you're ready." "Actually, I have a question to ask you," Jack said. "Yes," the voice said. "Are you the young lady who was working the drive-thru Tuesday night?" he asked. Yes, sir." She sounded uncomfortable. "Good. I've got something I need to say to you. I'll just pull up to the window, okay?" Would you like to speak to the manager?" "No, my beef is with you," Jack laughed. "Get it? Beef? Because you sell hamburgers?" He couldn't tell if the drive-thru worker thought this was funny or not. When he pulled up to the window, the young woman said, "Oh, you." "Yes, me," Jack said, "but I'm a very different me than I was last night. I wanted to apologize for my behavior. You were learning a new job, and you were doing your best and being very polite, and I was rude. I'm sorry." "Thank you?" the young woman said, but her inflection rose as if she were asking a question. Clearly she was finding this encounter puzzling. "Thank you," Jack said, "for your politeness and understanding." He sat there and smiled at her. "You're welcome." The young woman looked at the line of cars growing behind Jack's vehicle. "Did you want to order anything, sir?" she asked. "No, I'm good." He found himself chuckling. "I'm really, really good. You have a nice night now." "You too." Jack drove away, feeling the weight of one of his regrets lifting. But fixing one isolated incident, like a drive-thru dust-up, was easy. With Becky, with Tyson, there were years of bad behavior on his part, way more than he could fix with a simple "I'm sorry." An idea popped into Jack's head. Donuts. Donuts would be a start. Back when he and Becky had been young and broke, they used to meet for dates at the Donkey Dough Man, an all-night donut place near the coffee shop where Becky had been working at that time. Despite its stupid name, the Donkey Dough Man was the perfect place for a cheap date. The two of them would scrape up enough money for a donut each chocolate frosted for Becky, and maple frosted for Jack, and 2 cups of coffee. The manager didn't mind that they only spent $5 and took up a booth for hours, talking and drinking cup after cup of coffee. Or if he did, he never said anything. That was back when he and Becky really talked to each other, before the money, before parenthood, before all the stresses of responsible adult life. They talked earnestly about their dreams, their goals, their future. If Jack brought home donuts from the Donkey Dough Man, maybe it would remind her of those conversations. Maybe it would be the first step toward getting them to talking again. There was no street parking near the donut shop, so Jack had to use the parking garage a block away. He wasn't thrilled by this fact, really. The Donkey Dough Man wasn't in the safest neighborhood to be wandering at night, but he had become increasingly convinced that showing up with a bag of donuts might be the path back to Becky's heart. It was a thoughtful gesture, and it had been a long time since he'd been thoughtful. Jack didn't like parking garages. There was something eerie about the flickering fluorescent lighting and the way sounds echoed. The elevators always seemed to be on the verge of breaking and were infested by foul and mysterious odors. Jack breathed a sigh of relief when the elevator doors opened. He hustled toward the garage's exit. At first, he heard only the sound of his own shuffling footsteps, but then he was sure he heard another pair of footsteps behind him. He casually glanced over his shoulder. There was no need to be afraid. It was probably just some regular person on a regular errand like he was. But Jack saw no one. He chalked it up to the weird echo effect of the parking garage and walked through the exit onto the street. He walked past a dry cleaner's and an insurance office. Most of the businesses on the street were dark and locked up for the night, but in the distance he could see the lights of the Donkey Dough Man sign with its smiling donut mascot. He heard the footsteps behind him again. He turned around, but only saw a flash of movement as whoever it was ducked into an alley. Jack was pretty sure he was being paranoid. After his near-death experience earlier in the day, it made sense that his nerves were on edge. He heard the steps again. They sounded wet, squishy, like somebody walking in galoshes in the rain. Jack started walking more quickly, and the steps sped up to match his. He was tempted to turn around and confront the person, but what good would that do if the person were armed? He broke into a run, though he knew he was too out of shape to run for long. The squishy steps behind him ran too. Suddenly, the donut shop seemed too far away to be a safe destination. He had to go inside somewhere to find a place with people and lights, a place where his pursuer would not follow him. He caught sight of an office building on the left, tried the door, and found it open. Once inside, he noticed that the door had a chain, which he quickly fastened. There was also a lock on the doorknob, which he turned. Feeling a little safer, he took a deep breath and turned around to survey the space where he found himself. There were no people, and the only light was from a single bare bulb overhead. The building looked abandoned. Graffiti had been spray-painted all over the walls. The glass in the windows had been smashed, and the doors that had once led to offices had been torn off their hinges. He glanced inside one room to see a desk and a broken office chair and piles of garbage, probably from people who had been squatting in the place. Squatters. There was something else to fear, but the building was as silent as a mausoleum, and he seriously doubted that the potential mugger who had been following him would go to the trouble of trying to unlock the building's front door. For the first time being, he was safe. He glanced back at the front door, just to confirm that he'd locked it, and saw there was movement in the tiny crack between the bottom of the door and the floor. Something was oozing through the crack. It was some sort of gelatinous substance, and its movement was slow and steady. It was pink, but it was a horrible pink, not the pink of cake frosting and party balloons. It was the pink of some living creature's insides. Jack took a step backward. He knew he needed to move more quickly, but he was transfixed by the sight of whatever was in front of him. Although it had the appearance of some sort of goo, it seemed to be moving under its own power. It wasn't an inanimate substance. It was alive. The sudden realization shook Jack out of his trance, and he ran down the hallway. He heard the squishy, sloppy steps behind him again, but he didn't turn around to look. He just kept running. At the end of the hall was a door marked Exit. He pushed on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Was it locked from the outside? Broken? He turned around. The thing, whatever it was getting closer. It was a pile of parts he couldn't make sense of. Much of it was somewhere between solid and liquid, but there were fully solid parts as well. Bundles of long, snake-like tubes, veiny bags, and pouches. When Jack was a little boy, he spent winter break at his grandparents' farm. He remembered watching his grandpa and uncle butcher a hog once. They hung its body from a tree. His uncle had sliced the hog's middle, and its guts had spilled out into a bucket with a sickening splat. This thing, that was how it sounded when it moved. Since he had no luck with the exit, Jack tried another nearby door. It was unlocked. He quickly opened it, darted in, and slammed and locked the door behind him. He was inside another ruined office. The floor was strewn with garbage, and the window was cracked. But strangely, a plaque still hung on the wall saying Employee of the Month, and an empty bookshelf about the height of Jack's waist had been knocked onto the floor. Jack dragged it to the door and shoved it on the doorknob at an angle. Winded, Jack sat down in the chair behind the desk. Here he was, looking like the boss he had been for years, but in a ruined office, hiding in fear for his life. He should have known the locked door was useless. Long, slimy tendrils were already snaking their way through the cracks underneath it. Pink slime dripped around the sides of the door and pooled onto the floor, merging itself with the creeping tendrils. Jack looked to the window as a possible escape route, but more of the globby substance was slithering over the windowsill. Jack looked back at the door, where the thing continued to ooze out. Is there more than one thing? Or is it all the same thing? What is happening? There was a loud slurping sound, like someone trying to pull their feet out of deep mud. Rapidly, so fast he couldn't even make sense of it, the mass of slime and solids reconstituted itself into an upright being that sat in the chair across the desk from Jack. The thing had approximations of arms and legs, and a lumpy mound that stood in for a head. It was made of the translucent pink goo, under which its organs were visible. Somehow it reminded Jack of the awful gelatin salad his mom used to make, with canned fruit suspended under the slimy surface. It had no mouth or nose, but it had eyes, dark eyes that stared at Jack as though the thing could see into him the way he could see into it. What do you want?" Jack asked, his voice trembling. He didn't want to die, not when he had just one near miss, not when he was just remembering what was important. The creature kept looking at him. Then slowly, it raised one arm and reached toward him. Like elastic, its arm stretched, growing thinner as it reached across the length of the desk to touch Jack's face. Pain like Jack had never known shot through him, but it wasn't physical pain. He felt the pain of hurt, neglect, abuse. It was the pain of every employee he ever yelled at or fired. The pain of his son every time he missed one of his ball games or unfairly criticized him. The pain of his wife for every forgotten birthday or unkind word. Jack was filled with all the emotional pain he ever caused, and it was more intense than he could ever bear. He doubled over and squeezed his tear-filled eyes shut. Sure, he was about to die from a real broken heart. But then the pain left him, just as suddenly as it had come, and he was awash in an overwhelming sense of relief. When he opened his eyes, the creature was gone. Becky was in bed, but awake, watching one of her shows about home remodeling on TV. "Hiya, Bex," Jack said, pleased to hear his old pet name for her come out of his mouth. He sat down on the bed next to her. "Can I talk to you for a few minutes?" "Sure." She aimed the remote and switched off the TV. "Is everything okay? You're not sick or anything, are you?" Her brow furrowed like it did when she was worried. "No, it's nothing like that." "Good. I mean, it's just been a really long time since you seemed like you wanted to talk to me. So I was afraid it was going to be something bad." "It is bad, but you've done nothing wrong. I wanted to say, I know I've been a bad husband lately, and I'm sorry." Lately didn't begin to cover it. He knew. He couldn't remember the last time he'd acted like a decent husband. Maybe when Tyson was little? Wow. There were tears in her eyes, which she wiped away. "I wasn't expecting that." "Well, from now on, you can expect better of me. You can demand better of me." He felt his eyes getting a little teary too. Part of the reason I've been so on edge is money. The business isn't doing well, Bex. The animatronics keep breaking. Families aren't showing up. I'm losing all this money on food. I don't know how much longer the pizza playground can limp along. Becky took his hand and held it. It had been a long time since she had done that. Oh, honey, you should have told me. And here I've been yammering away about remodeling and all this stuff that cost a lot of money. I never would have even suggested it if I'd known you'd been worried about money. From now on, you've got to promise to tell me when something's wrong. Jack nodded. I will. I promise. And I promise I'll do the same. She looked him in the eyes. Actually, I think the reason I've obsessed over the house so much is that I've been sad ever since Tyson left home. Fixing things up in the house distracted me from how much I miss him. I miss him too, Jack said. Nobody tells you how hard it's going to be when your kid goes off to college. Becky wiped another tear away. They act like it's one big party, but it's actually not. But it's not. Actually, I've been thinking I might go back to work. There was an opening at my old real estate office, and they called to ask if I was interested. I figured that way I could keep my mind active and see other people during the day. She squeezed his hand. Plus, if I get a job, we'd have 2 incomes instead of 1. It might ease some of your financial worries. Jack tucked a lock of hair behind her ear. If that's really what you want to do, then I support you. Back before Tyson was born, Becky had been a successful real estate agent. He had to admit that the thought of someone else in the family earning money was comforting. It's really what I want to do, she smiled. There's no need to be a stay-at-home mom when there's no kids staying at home anymore. It was either get a job or get a dog to turn into my surrogate child. I think you made the right choice, Jack said, smiling in return. Say, do you think Tyson's still up? It's not even 11, and he's a college student, Becky said. Of course he's still up. Of course he's still up. For him, the night is young. She snuggled down under the covers. But it's past my bedtime. Mine too, Jack agreed. But all the same, I want to give Tyson a call. Jack took his phone into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. Tyson answered on the first ring, but he sounded low. Hey, buddy, Jack said. I just wanted to check in to see how you're doing. I promised I haven't spent any more of your money if that's what you wanted to know. No, I wasn't calling about money. I was calling about you. Really? Tyson's tone had a hard edge. Because when we talked earlier this week, you wouldn't even let me tell you about the car emergency I had. You were too upset that I charged your credit card $900 to make the repairs.